In today's video, we're going to talk about the 10 ways that circumcision, the sign of the covenant between Abram and God, is just like Jesus and the crucifixion. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Bob Balch with the That's Jesus channel. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today we're going to be talking about the 10 ways that circumcision from Genesis chapter 17, that this sign of the covenant between Abram and God is just like the crucifixion of Jesus. Before we get started, I would like for you to pause this video if you haven't already read Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 through 14. Pause this video, read that. We'll wait for you till you get back, and welcome back. Well, the covenant promises. By this point, we're in the story. We're in chapter 17 of Genesis. Our memory verse, if you like memory verses, is Genesis chapter 17, verse 11. It says, "You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you." So it's been 13 years since Abram's son Ishmael was born. He was already old in chapter 16. He was 86. Now he's 99, and the Lord appears to him. Now, the Lord doesn't just come in a dream or vision. The Lord actually appears to Abram. And the first thing that God announces to Abram is this name. He says, "I am God Almighty." He says, "I am El Shaddai." And then he orders an order directly to Abram. He says, number one, walk before me. And number two, he says, be blameless. And then God adds some promises to the promises that he's already made to Abram. So a couple of those promises, let's go back and review, just in case you are not familiar with the promises that God has made to Abram. Abram has left Ur, right? Ur of the Chaldeans. And he has left on this journey because God has promised him something. So let's look a little bit at those promises. Way back in Genesis chapter 12, 5 chapters ago, God promised that Abram would be made into a great nation. That's the first one. Number 2, that I will bless you. Number 3, I will make your name great. Number 4, you will be a blessing. Number 5, I will bless those who bless you. Number 6, whoever curses you, I will curse. And then number 7, and this one's really important, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you, Abram. That's significant. The next chapter, chapter 13, the promise is expanded just a little bit. The situation has Abram looking over land, and God says, all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. And then the second thing that he says in Genesis chapter 13 is, I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. Nothing happens in chapter 14 regarding promises, but in chapter 15, we're given a lot of details, along with some very specific foreknowledge. So this is all just review, remember this, but the first thing that he's promised, God says that a son who is Abram's own flesh and blood will be his heir. It won't be his servant. God says, count the stars, so shall your offspring be. That's the second one. And then there's these prophetic words from God himself. He says, for 400 years, your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, where they will be enslaved and mistreated. This is way back towards the end of Genesis. And, when they come out of it is an exodus, but this is their captivity in Egypt, right? Number 4, God says he will punish the nation that they serve as slaves, and afterward they'll come out with great possessions. Number 5, you'll go on to your ancestors in peace, be buried at a good old age. Number 6, in the 4th generation, he's being very specific how long they will be in Egypt as slaves. In your 4th generation, your descendants will come back here. And number 7, to your descendants, I will give this land. And then he kind of outlines the land there. The next chapter in Genesis 16, Abram is not given the promises this time. It is his wife, Sarai's handmaid, Hagar. Now, Abram and Hagar have had sex, and they have created a child. It was the thought that, well, I'm haven't had any kids yet. God said it's going to come from me. I might as well take the initiative and impregnate my wife's handmaid. Actually, it was kind of Sarah's idea, but still, Ishmael is going to be the offspring of Hagar, but Hagar, before she has Ishmael, is very upset because Sarai is really treating her badly, so she runs away, and God talks to Hagar and gives Hagar these promises. These are the promises to Hagar, which in essence are also promises to Abram. Number one, God said, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be numerous to count. Number two, you will give birth to a son. 3, you will name him Ishmael. 4, he's going to be a wild donkey of a man. 5, his hand will be against everyone. 6, everyone's hand is going to be against him. And number 7, he's going to live in hostility towards all of his brothers. So that's a lot of wonderful, wonderful promises. You've got free land. You've got countless descendants. You've got a legacy that includes being made into a great nation. Abram is even promised that everyone on earth would be blessed through him. Everyone on earth is going to be blessed through Abram. That's huge, right? So, but there are some requirements. We're now in chapter 17, and Abram is finally given the full scope of the covenant. Abram and his descendants will be called upon to do 3 things. The first verse of chapter 17 talks about 2 of them. It says, walk faithfully before God and be blameless. And the third thing is mentioned a little bit further down. God says you need to be circumcised. Now, we're going to be taking a big look at circumcision here in just a minute, but let's just look at the first 2 really quick. Walking faithfully before God is an interesting phrase. This word faithfully is not actually used in the original Hebrew. It's included in several thought-for-thought versions of the Bible, like the New International Version. And it's not bad that they put that word in there because it does convey the implied understanding of what was being said. But the actual Hebrew simply reads, walk before me. And only 2 men had ever walked with God. That's Enoch and Noah. Those are pretty huge, important guys. One of them was taken. He didn't see death. And Noah, he and his family were the only ones who survived the flood. So if God says, you need to walk faithfully with me, that's a big deal. So this is a pretty high standard. It's a call for Abram. But the other part of that short phrase, which is incredibly important, is that Abram is to walk before God. This word before doesn't mean that God wants Abram to walk in front of him down the path of life or anything like that. It's not that kind of word. It's kind of like the word you bring in someone and they're going to stand before you. That's the kind of word it is. It's the same word that's translated as surface way back in Genesis chapter 1, as in the Holy Spirit was on the surface of the waters, or it's translated as face. From your face I will be hidden. That is Cain, right? Or sight. Everything was corrupt in the sight of God. That's right before the flood. And in this instance, God is telling Abram that he has to live a dedicated life. Here it is, in God's presence. God is telling Abram that he needs to be loyal to El Shaddai. He needs to be loyal to the God who is almighty. God is calling Abram to serve him with total devotion. In short, this phrase, calling on Abram to walk faithfully before God, is saying, Abram, faithfully yield yourself to God without question and be united with him. And it's the first command that God gives Abram, and it's all about relationship. Now, the second command that God gives Abram, we're going to cut out all the preliminaries. It's just all about holiness. God called Abram and his offspring to be, here's the word, blameless. Now, this word blameless, it's used about 100 times in the Old Testament. It's only used twice in Genesis, though. Once to describe Noah as being blameless, and once to describe God's expectations for Abram and his community. Now, 3/4 of the other instances of this word blameless are in Leviticus and Numbers in the book of Ezekiel. And almost every single time, this word blameless is describing the standard of the animals that are going to be sacrificed. Every animal had to meet these standards before being worthy of being sacrificed to God. They had to be without defect. They had to be unblemished, spotless. They were to be untainted. They were to be flawless. In essence, God is calling Abram and his offspring to be holy and perfect. So those are the first two commands. And then the Lord gives Abram a reminder about those future blessings one last time before springing the third and final command on him, the circumcision. Now I kind of laugh about that a little bit because it's this passage of scripture is actually kind of funny. It's kind of like an employer is telling you, here's your new job, and the expectations are X, Y, and Z, but Z is really horrible, right? So it's like, okay, Bob, if you take this job, you're going to have to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every single day of the year, no holidays, no sick time, no time off. Plus, you're going to be expected to always represent the company by never being seen in anything other than a tuxedo. And now, before I get to the next part of the job, let me remind you about our benefits package. It's like the first two aren't hard enough. And that's exactly what happens here. Okay, Abram, if you agree to this covenant, you're going to have to do whatever I tell you without hesitation. And then you're also going to need to always represent me by living flawlessly and perfectly. And now, before I get to this next part of the covenant, let me remind you about those promises one more time. And so that's what God does. He says, okay, let's go through these promises so that you don't forget how big a deal this covenant is. And so in chapter 17, God reiterates and he expounds on these promises to Abram. He says, number one, I will make my covenant between us and will greatly increase your numbers. He's repeated that, right? Number two, you will be the father of many nations. Now that's different. Before, Abram was just going to be the father of a nation, of a great nation. Now it's going to be many nations. It's going to be more than one nation. Number three, I will make you very fruitful. 4, I will make nations of you. 5, kings will come from you. Kings. I mean, that's a big deal. 6, I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. So this promise is not just to Abram, it's going to be in perpetuity. It's going to be for all of his descendants as well. Number 7, the whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give to you as an everlasting possession. So that's kind of a repetition. 8, I will be their God, this because the land is going to be for his descendants as well. Number 9, as for Sarai, your wife, I will bless her, not Hagar. So Sarai is going to be the one that's blessed and will surely give you a son by her. And so now the cat's out of the bag. Abram, you didn't need to impregnate your wife's handmaid. The promise is through your wife, Sarai. 10, I will bless her so that she becomes the mother of nations. 11, kings of people will come from her. 12, Sarai, it's going to be Sarah, actually. The name change things we'll get to in the next chapter or the next video. Sarai will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. Number 13, I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And then he reiterates a couple of things about Ishmael. As for Ishmael, I have heard you, I will surely bless him. 15, I will make him fruitful, will greatly increase his numbers. 16, he will be the father of 12 rulers. And number 17, I will make him into a great nation, only singular, great nation. And so that clarifies things a bit, does it? Abram is not going to be the father of just one nation. He's going to be the father of many nations. Multiple kings are going to come from him. Abram is then told that Sarai will have a son named Isaac. She will be the mother of many nations and kings. Abram also learns that not only was Hagar not lying when she said that he would have innumerable descendants through Ishmael, but Ishmael would be the father of 12 rulers and also be a great nation. But did you notice that there's a promise that was missing? Did you catch it? It's mentioned in chapter 12, and it's going to be repeated in chapter 22, and it's even going to be given to Isaac in chapter 26. But for some reason, there's one promise that is missing. It's the promise about all nations on earth will be blessed. And that's a big miss unless that promise is not missing and it somehow is going to get carried out through something else in this discussion with Abram. So we're now going to get into the covenant of circumcision. Now, I have made chapters. If you look in the description of the video, there's some chapters for this. And if you want to skip past this description of what circumcision is, I certainly understand that. The fact of the matter is that I was really shocked that some Christian colleges actually have to explain what circumcision is to new students, even those who come from a long background of going to and being involved in churches across America. So for the sake of clarity, I am going to endeavor to explain exactly what circumcision is. Now, this is a description that is only applicable to typical males with no unique deviations from the normal physiological attributes in regards to their reproductive organs, okay? So just remember that. Here we go. This is very simple. Males are born with outies and females are born with innies. I think we all understand that, but we do need to be quite specific. And so here's your last chance. I'm going to be graphic in my description here. If you don't want to listen to the graphic details of circumcision, please skip to the next chapter in the video. Okay, here we go. The external genitalia of a male, they consist of the scrotum, which contains the testes, and the penis. That's the external male reproductive organs. The end of the male reproductive organ has a ridge. It's called the corona, and then a larger portion called the glans. And on the tip of the glans is the urethra. That's the opening where urine comes out. And there is a piece of skin that covers the corona and the glands. It extends almost all the way to the urethra. And it's called the prepuce, or most commonly it's known as the foreskin. Circumcision is the removal, the cutting away of that foreskin. And that's all it is. But that does kind of beg the question, why would circumcision be used as a sign of the covenant between Abram and God? Right? That's a great question. And I think to answer that, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss a little bit of the history of circumcision and why it was an important thing 4,000 years ago. To answer it, we're going to get into exactly why someone would want to remove the foreskin of the male reproductive organ in the first place. And believe it or not, Abram and his clan were not the first people to ever be circumcised. In fact, when Abram was in Egypt, he probably saw circumcision. It was a practice that was done in Egypt. We actually have archaeological evidence that graphically displays adult men in Egypt being circumcised from before the captivity of the Jews in Egypt, probably before Abraham as well. We have Australian Aborigines and Polynesians were practicing circumcision way before circumcised missionaries ever attempted to proselytize them. In fact, Christopher Columbus was shocked to find several Native American tribes, including the Incas and the Aztecs and the Mayans, that were practicing circumcision when he came to the Americas. So why would those cultures independently decide to cut off this piece of skin from the male reproductive organ? Well, I think the common factor to look at is the location of all of those civilizations. All of them are located between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. All of them are located close to the equator. And the natural consequence of those whereabouts is a climate where it's quite warm. Temperatures are going to make a typical male human body produce a lot of perspiration. And as we can all attest to, if we ever spent any time around a sixth grade boy, the lack of consistent bathing with a antibacterial soap or deodorant soap or something like that is going to cause the body to retain some bacteria in certain places where skin-on-skin contact is the norm, like your armpits and the groin area and the skin of the foreskin on the end of the male reproductive organ. So adding to that, we're dealing with a body part that expels urine, of all things. It comes into direct contact with the natural moisture of a female anatomy if you're an adult and you're married. And it is usually kept out of the sunlight, right? So bacteria and fungi can thrive there. If regular cleaning habits are not utilized, this uncircumcised foreskin will actually retain its natural lubricating secretions, which it has. It will retain dead skin cells and sweat, and it can even, if left unclean for a while, can harbor a foul-smelling substance. Simply put, the male reproductive organ, specifically the end where the foreskin is, and especially if it's covered by a foreskin, is easily the most unclean part of the male body. So how unclean is unclean? So let's get into a couple of modern-day medical discussions regarding this. The Mayo Clinic, the United States National Institute of Health, Johns Hopkins University, as well as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, have all published papers on the benefits of circumcision. All of them have. And all of them can be used as a source to show that uncircumcised males in the 21st century are more at risk of urinary tract infections as infants and somewhat as adults if you're uncircumcised. It's just you're at a higher risk. You also, if you're not circumcised, you have a higher risk for penile cancer. You're more at risk for contracting sexually transmitted diseases. And your female partner, if you're uncircumcised, is also more at risk for cervical cancer. So are those risks significant as of the making of this video? And I'm going to be honest with you, no. Those risks are definitely not significant in 21st century United States of America, where most of the people who live here have good access to clean water and soap and antibiotics and creams and things like that. So no, those risks are not very large. And those sources that I cited, they're going to tell you that there are risks, but they are not big risks. However, we have to take that into account that that's the world that we live in. Access to clean water is only a faucet away for most people who are watching this video. Soap is common. It's cheap. Many men have careers that keep them in climate-controlled buildings almost 24/7. They don't even have to go outside and sweat. And antibiotics, oral, topical, they're easy to come by. However, these people that we're talking about, Abram, that's 4,000 years ago. Only the super wealthy are not day laborers. And even the richest people in the world didn't have access to climate-controlled buildings or modern medicine or running water. The health risks of not being circumcised were exponentially much greater back then than they are today. And so that's the world that Abraham lived in. So what do we do with all of that information? Let's get back to Genesis chapter 17. Abram is told that the sign of the covenant with God would be circumcision. Not only that, he's informed that every single male in his community, even his slaves, would have to be circumcised. Now, that's a big deal. They're going to have to be circumcised now, but it's not a one-time thing. Every generation that comes after him is also going to have to be circumcised. Every male had to be circumcised. From the 8th day of birth, they have to be circumcised. And the penalty for refusal to be circumcised, it's very simple. It's very to the point. They'd be expelled from the rest of the community. They wouldn't be allowed to be in the community if they were not circumcised. So with the exception of Abram receiving a new name, and we're going to cover that in the next video probably, a succinct summation of the first 14 verses of Genesis chapter 17 goes like this. Number 1, God is the Almighty. Number 2, God's first command is all about relationship. Number 3, God's second command is all about holiness. Number 4, God reiterates and expands on his promises to Abram. And number 5, God's third command is all about the covenant of the flesh. So bring that all together. Let's break down some of what we've learned in today's really kind of a long video. Sorry about that. I think we all understand the significance of being in a relationship with God and being set apart for God's purposes. I mean, we're taught those things in Sunday school from an early age. But what about this covenant of the flesh? Why is it so special? Was God just looking for an inconspicuous place for all of his people to get cut in order to ratify this blood covenant? And if so, why not choose someplace a little bit more convenient, right? It's not about convenience. Circumcision was chosen for several reasons. And I'm going to briefly go through what circumcision looked like for Abram, and then I'm going to parallel that for what circumcision looked like 2,000 years later when God became flesh and was crucified for all of mankind. The similarities between the circumcision of Abram and his descendants and the crucifixion of Jesus are astounding. Now, first, let's just talk about the first two commands just for a second. You remember that Abram is called to walk with God, and that's all about relationship. He's supposed to be in a close relationship with God. He's supposed to be so close that whatever God asks him to do, he will jump up and he will do it. And the second thing is Abram is told to be flawless. He's supposed to be blameless. He's supposed to be perfect. And that language is used most often when talking about the sacrificial animal. It was going to be blameless and flawless. Can you think of anyone other than Jesus that can fit that bill more than anyone else in history? Someone who walked with God the Father and who was blameless? I mean, that's Jesus right there. But let's talk about these 10 things that they would look at from Abram's point of view, and then as we're looking back at the crucifixion, how they parallel each other. So number 1, it's the cutting away of the foreskin. It's the proof that God was in covenant with Abram. Now that seems like it should kind of be the other way around, right? Abram is the one going through the ordeal, so logic would dictate that circumcision was the evidence of Abram's commitment to the agreement. But that's not what the text says. In verse 13 it says, "My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant." And so this circumcision is a confirmation that God is willing to keep his promises, even if it means that those he loves have to endure a painful experience to make sure that they remember that covenant. And then God takes it a step further and he says, and anyone who refuses to go through that circumcision, anyone who refuses to remove that uncleanliness, that whole person can no longer be in the community. And so the parallel 2,000 years later is astounding. Paul explains in 2 Corinthians 5, verses 18 through 21, that God reconciled us to himself through the crucifixion by becoming sin on our behalf. God became the unclean thing that had to be discarded in order for the covenant with God to be fulfilled. God in human form literally became the cutting away of the foreskin. And through this ghastly circumcision that took place on the cross, God confirmed that he kept his promises, even if that meant having the one that he loved having to endure that painful experience to make sure that others remembered their covenant with God. But God took it a step further, right? As the Jews refused to accept God's perfect and blameless Son who walked with him, they treated his Son as if he was unclean, and they cut him off from their community. And then God turned the tables on them, right? Their rejection was the very thing that could circumcise their hearts and bring them into a community with God. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what a parent it had to do in Abram's community, right? It's the parent who's submitting their innocent child to this painful act. Why would a parent let their child go through a hurt like this? Right? We can kind of ask ourselves that same thing, though, right? Why do we allow our newborn children to have blood tests and get vaccinations and things like that? It's because it's better for them in the long run. And this is the same thing for circumcision. This act not only signified a covenant between God and his people, it literally removed the most unclean part of a man's body, ensuring that in the future, that man will not suffer for the consequences of uncleanness. And 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years after Abram, God is the parent. God the Father is the parent who submits his innocent Son to a very painful act, crucifixion. And why would God let his Son go through a hurt like that? It's because it's going to be better off for his other children in the long run. This act of crucifixion not only signified a covenant between God and mankind, it removed the unclean part of man that would result in eternal consequences. That unclean part of man that was removed was sin. Okay, the third one. The third one is interesting. For adults, and remember when Abram did this, he was an adult. He's 99 years old, and he's going to circumcise himself. So, and then everyone else in his community, he's going to circumcise them. Some of these men might have been with him for a long time. They might have been in their 80s or their 70s or something. And for that, if you're an adult going through circumcision, it is a subservient and humbling experience. Some would even say it's humiliating to an extent. First, it took a tremendous amount of courage and self-denial if you do it yourself. And second, if you don't do it yourself, if you have someone do the circumcision on you, it takes a lot of trust to allow someone else to do it. So 2,000 years later, Jesus is on the cross, and God's Son, actually God himself in human form. Crucifixion is a subservient and humbling experience. He's stripped naked. He's ridiculed. It's humiliating, to say the least. And it took a tremendous amount of courage and self-denial to volunteer for something like that. And it takes a lot of trust for us to take up our cross and follow Jesus. The fourth thing is that, it is a deliberate plan. It's not just something I'm going to get around to it when I get around to it. It is a deliberate plan. The child's father has to ensure that their son is circumcised. Some Jewish traditions, even today, go so far as to say that the father himself has to be the one who actually circumcises his son. There's this quote. It says, "It is a positive commandment for the father to circumcise his son, and this commandment is greater than all other positive commandments." That's from actual Jewish literature from a very respected Jewish rabbi. And 2,000 years ago, think about this. It was God the Father's deliberate plan. He is God, the Father. He's going to ensure that the Son is crucified. Acts 2:23 says, quote, "This man, this Jesus, was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge." God was the one in control of this. God the Father was controlling this happening to his Son, Jesus. The fifth one is circumcision is oriented to males only. Now, this is interesting. way back in Genesis 3, God told Eve that her offspring would crush the head of the enemy. Back in chapter 12, Abram was promised that in him all families of the earth would be blessed. Yet this mark of the covenant is reserved to males only. So just think about that. The proof of God's promises, it's evident only by the submission of a male going through this cutting away. Did you catch that? 2,000 years later, the proof of God's eternal covenant only came about because God chose to become a male and submit himself to a crucifixion that fulfilled the need for the sin of man to be cut away. The sixth one, circumcision is bloody and painful. 4,000 years ago, done as an adult with no anesthesia, I'm sure that Abram remembered that for the rest of his life. It would be one of the most memorable and unpleasant experiences that a man could ever go through. But done as a child on the 8th day, who's going to be the one who's uncomfortable with that? It's going to be the parent is the one who remembers that stress of the procedure. And the parent is the one who's going to open their arms and console their child that they just subjected to that pain. And did that happen 2,000 years later when Jesus was crucified? Yeah. Crucifixion is bloody and painful. And if it's done with no anesthesia, it's awful. You know, they offered Jesus vinegar mixed with gall or wine mixed with myrrh, and he refused to drink it because that would have dulled his senses and made the crucifixion less painful. He refused to drink something so that he could feel every bit of the pain involved with crucifixion. This crucifixion was done to God's Son, and on the 8th day, Sunday, just like the 8th day when circumcision is done, God sent angels to console his other children who had watched their Savior being crucified, and God raised up his Son on the 8th day. All right, you ready? I only got a couple more. Number 8, this one is short. Circumcision cuts off the most unclean thing on a human male body that can be removed. And 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years after Abram, crucifixion of God's Son cut off the most unclean thing in a man, and that is sin. Only got 2 more. Number 9. Number 9 is that circumcision dictates whether you are in or out of the community. If you refuse to have that unclean thing cut off, then you are considered unclean and you're cut off from the community. Likewise, with the crucifixion, that dictates whether you are in or out of God's community. If you refuse to have your sin cut off by believing the gospel of the one crucified for you, then you are considered unclean and you are not going to be in the community. You are going to be eternally cut off from God's community if you don't have your sin cut off by believing in the gospel and the one who's crucified for you. And now the last one, number 10, this is probably the most, I think this is the shortest one, but it's also the one that I think is very important. Circumcision was the mark of our commitment to an intimate and everlasting relationship with God. That's what Abraham looked at it like. That this circumcision is my mark of a commitment to God. God offered this to me and I took it. 2,000 years later, crucifixion is the mark of God's commitment to an intimate and everlasting relationship with us. In Colossians 2, verses 11 through 14, Paul explains that because Christ was crucified physically, we were all circumcised with a circumcision not performed by human hands. Our circumcision was not just a tiny piece of flesh that's prone to uncleanness being cut off. No, our whole self that was ruled by the flesh was circumcised through the crucifixion of Jesus. All this happened so that God could create nations through Abram. The first nation was identified by a cutting away of an unclean foreskin. The second nation identified by the cutting away of an unclean heart. Deuteronomy 10, verse 16, Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, even Jeremiah 4:4, they are all clear that this circumcised heart was what God really, really wanted all along. And so when I was putting all this information together, it was the morning of Easter Sunday, 2023. And it occurred to me as I was putting all this together that God did not forget to include that promise about Abram's seed blessing all the nations. He didn't forget to mention that in chapter 17. On the contrary, it's because of Genesis chapter 17 that all the nations of the world are blessed. It's because of Genesis chapter 17 that you and I can spread the word that every person in every nation, on every continent, around the globe, can be blessed with a permanent and personal relationship with God. And all of that is made possible through the selfless act of the seed of Abram. And that's Jesus. Hey, thank you so much for watching the video. There's lots of other aspects of circumcision that we could talk about. We just don't have time today, but I do appreciate you watching all the way in. I hope this video blessed you. If it did, go on and share it. Hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed yet, go on ahead and do that too. My name is Bob Balch with the That's Jesus channel. Thank you so much for watching. Be blessed.